The ballroom shimmered like a palace, bathed in golden light from towering crystal chandeliers that sparkled above the polished marble floor. The air smelled faintly of roses and expensive perfume, mingling with the fizz of champagne glasses clinking in elegant hands. Wealthy guests, adorned in glittering jewels and silken gowns, whispered among themselves in hushed, excited tones. The music of violins floated gently, almost as if the entire orchestra was aware that this night was not just another celebration, it was meant to be remembered, a show of power and splendor. Every detail spoke of extravagance. White roses climbing up marble pillars, silver trays overflowing with delicacies, and golden candlelight dancing off mirrors lining the walls. At the center of all this grandeur stood Adrian Blackwood, a man whose name alone commanded both admiration and fear. His black suit was perfectly tailored, his posture stiff with pride, his every movement calculated to display control. Adrian was a man who enjoyed being admired, not loved. The gleam in his eyes was not one of affection but of possession, as though the very gathering existed simply to showcase his triumph. He smiled when people bowed their heads in respect, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. To him, this wasn't just a wedding, it was another business deal, another victory to parade before society. Beside him stood Selina Moore, radiant in a white gown that shimmered like frost under candlelight. She was beautiful in a way that demanded attention, her every gesture bold, her chin lifted high as if daring anyone to question her right to be there. Unlike Adrian, who fed off power, Selina fed off envy. She wanted the room to stare, to whisper, to choke on their disbelief that the mistress had become the bride. Her red lips curved in satisfaction every time she caught a glance of jealousy. To her, this wedding was revenge against every woman who had ever looked down on her. The guests clapped politely as the ceremony prepared to begin, yet beneath the applause lingered unspoken questions. Not everyone could ignore the ghost that haunted Adrian's grandeur, Elena, his wife. The wife who had not been seen in weeks, the wife whose silence was louder than gossip. Some whispered she had left quietly, others said she was too frail, too broken to fight. Adrian had brushed aside every inquiry with a cold smirk, confident that Elena's absence would fade with time. But the silence was shattered in an instant. A rustle of gasps rippled through the crowd as the grand doors at the end of the hall creaked open. Slowly, a figure stepped inside. Elena appeared in the doorway, her pale face framed by loose strands of dark hair, her hand resting protectively on the curve of her swollen belly. She was fragile yet dignified, her presence trembling but undeniable. The music faltered, whispers turned sharp, and every eye fixed upon her as if a ghost had walked into the glittering heart of the wedding. A hush swept across the glittering hall as Elena's figure advanced beyond the threshold. The orchestra, as if gripped by the same shock as the guests, faltered and left only a trembling silence in its wake. Gasps turned into murmurs, sharp whispers slicing through the once celebratory air. "Isn't that his wife?" Someone breathed in disbelief, the words carrying across the room like fire catching dry wood. A cluster of women near the front covered their mouths, their jeweled bracelets clinking as they exchanged stunned glances. Men shook their heads, muttering about scandal, about shame, about the audacity of what they were witnessing. Adrian's face drained of color, the smug composure he had carried all evening dissolving into something raw, panic, guilt, and rage all at once. He froze in place, his mouth slightly parted as if words might form, yet none came. This was the collision he had always dreaded, the two halves of his life forced together under the eyes of hundreds. His hand twitched at his side, uncertain whether to extend toward Selina to reassure her or to reach for Elena, who looked as though she had conjured every ounce of her strength just to appear here tonight. Selina's painted lips curved into the faintest smile, but her eyes betrayed her fury. Beneath the veil of false calm, anger burned like a storm. She stood taller, shoulders squared, refusing to let anyone see the fear coiling in her stomach. Her gaze darted toward Adrian, accusing, demanding, "Why didn't you stop her?" But Adrian remained motionless, his silence exposing a weakness that unsettled even the most loyal of his admirers. Elena moved forward with quiet determination, each step measured, her hand pressed firmly to her swollen belly as though drawing courage from the life inside her. She did not shout. She did not accuse. She did not need to. Her silence, her very presence, was louder than any condemnation. Every eye followed her, and in that gaze, she seemed less like a fragile, discarded wife and more like a specter of truth come to strip away illusions. As she neared the altar, her breath began to quicken. A tremor ran through her body, her steps faltering. She reached for the edge of a chair to steady herself, her knuckles whitening as she clung on. Her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, and the color drained from her cheeks. Guests leaned forward in alarm, their whispers now edged with fear. Her lips parted as though she meant to speak, but only a fragile breath escaped. Then her knees buckled slightly, her body trembling as if about to give way. The spectacle of wealth and vanity crumbled in an instant, replaced by dread, as the pregnant wife's faltering breaths filled the silence of the hall. The moment seemed to stretch endlessly before anyone moved. Elena's body swayed, her face drained of what little color it had carried when she entered. A ripple of panic swept the hall as she gasped for air, her hand clutching at her belly, her other arm reaching helplessly toward the air as though something might hold her steady. Then, with a sudden shudder, her knees gave way. She collapsed onto the polished marble floor, her gown spreading around her like broken wings. A collective cry escaped from the guests, women shrieked, men rose from their seats, and the orchestra fell utterly silent. The sound of her body hitting the floor echoed, harsh and final, in a hall that only moments before had rung with music and laughter. Gasps turned into chaos. Chairs scraped back, heels clicked frantically, and the polished composure of the wealthy gathering shattered in an instant. Some rushed forward, their jeweled hands fluttering helplessly, others pulled back in horror, whispering sharp words. The wife, his wife, she's collapsing at his wedding. The scandal hung in the air heavier than the scent of roses, more suffocating than the candle smoke. Adrian moved, but his hesitation was obvious. His expression twisted with a mix of fear and fury. Fear of what was happening, fury that it was happening here, in front of everyone. He knelt halfway, then stopped, as though unsure whether to touch her, whether to let the crowd see him show concern for the woman he had tried to erase. His hands hovered uselessly, his pride and his panic battling silently. Selena's shriek pierced the clamor, raw and unrestrained. "She's ruining everything," she cried, her voice thick with rage rather than compassion. She pulled at Adrian's arm, demanding that he stay by her side instead of rushing to Elena's aid. Her face contorted with humiliation, the perfect mask of her triumph cracking under the weight of an unforeseen truth. She was not the star tonight, Elena was. Two servants darted forward, kneeling beside Elena, their uniforms stark against the shimmering gowns around them. One lifted her head gently, the other fanned her face with desperate hands. Elena's lips moved faintly, a whisper escaping, something about the baby, barely audible, yet enough to send shivers down the spine of those nearest. The murmurs spread, changing from scandal to fear, from whispers of disgrace to prayers for survival. The chandeliers sparkled mockingly above, as if indifferent to the collapse of dignity and pretense unfolding beneath them. The wedding, once glittering with arrogance, now trembled in the fragile breaths of a woman on the floor, fighting for more than just her own life. A commanding voice suddenly cut through the chaos, firm yet urgent. "Give her space. Move back now." The guests parted instinctively as a young man in a dark suit pushed his way forward, his expression sharp with purpose. He was not just another guest, he was a doctor, one who had come to witness the wedding, never expecting his skills to be needed. He dropped to his knees beside Elena, brushing aside a panicked servant with steady authority. "She needs air. Clear the crowd, open the windows if you can," he barked, his hands already checking her pulse, his ear leaning close to listen for her breath. The room stilled in uneasy silence, the clamor quieting as they watched him work. He loosened the fabric around her neck, lifted her wrist, and pressed fingers against her skin. His brow furrowed. "Her heart is racing, she's in distress," he muttered under his breath, then raised his voice, louder now, commanding attention. "This isn't just a fainting spell. She's going into premature labor." Gasps erupted once more, sharp as broken glass. Women clutched their pearls, men exchanged grim, uneasy glances. The scandal of a wife's intrusion was instantly overshadowed by the reality of life and death unfolding before their eyes. Adrian hovered behind the doctor, his face pale, torn between the desperate need to protect his image and the undeniable fear for the woman on the floor. His lips parted as though to say something, but no sound came. For once, the powerful Adrian Blackwood stood powerless. Selina, her fury unmasked, hissed from the sidelines. "She's faking it. She just wants attention. She's ruining everything." Her words, venomous and shrill, drew cold stares from the guests. No one dared agree with her now, not with the sight of Elena's trembling body before them and the doctor's grave voice declaring the danger. The doctor turned sharply, his voice steady and unyielding. "If we don't act fast, both mother and child could die." The words dropped like stones into the silent hall, final and heavy. Suddenly, the glittering ballroom no longer felt like a palace of triumph. It felt like a battlefield where pride, love, and life itself now hung in the balance. The wedding guests, once dazzled by champagne and chandeliers, now sat frozen in their seats, their eyes darting between the doctor's grim face and the unconscious figure of Elena. The murmur of violins had long gone silent, replaced by the restless hum of whispers. The wife, the baby, in labor, at his wedding. The words swirled like poison through the gilded air, staining the celebration beyond repair. Selina's fury boiled over. Her veil quivered as she stomped toward Adrian, gripping his arm with a claw-like hand. "Do something," she hissed. "Don't just stand there letting her steal everything from me." Her voice carried, shrill and venomous, and though she tried to cloak it with indignation, the guests heard only cruelty. Eyes narrowed at her, lips pursed in disapproval. The glamour that had once set her apart now looked garish, vulgar against the pale dignity of the woman struggling on the floor. Adrian raised his hands weakly, his voice uneven. "Everyone, please, stay calm," he muttered, but the words lacked weight. They fluttered into the air like scraps of paper, ignored and trampled beneath the heavy silence of the hall. His authority, once absolute, was crumbling. Where once he commanded respect with his wealth and arrogance, now he looked small, cornered, stripped of control. The doctor's sharp voice cut through. "She needs to be moved, now. To the hospital." His urgency silenced even Selina's protests. Servants scrambled to fetch blankets and prepare to lift Elena carefully, their faces pale with fear. Selina tried one final desperate strike. "She's pretending. Can't you all see? She's destroying what should be the happiest day of our lives." Her words, however, only drew sharp glares and muttered curses. One older woman, draped in diamonds, shook her head in disgust. "Happiest day? With another man's wife still alive." The shame in the words clung to Selina like tar, and she faltered, her fury suddenly making her appear desperate rather than victorious. As Elena was lifted from the marble floor, her hand twitched against her belly, her lips whispering again about the baby. The guests, who had come to bask in wealth and power, now rose in hushed solemnity, watching a fragile woman carried toward the uncertain night. The wedding, once glittering and proud, lay shattered in their memories, broken under the weight of truth and tragedy. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and urgency, a stark contrast to the perfume-soaked ballroom Elena had left behind. The sterile white walls seemed to press in on everyone as the stretcher wheeled her through swinging doors, her frail body dwarfed by the sheets that clung to her trembling frame. Nurses hurried alongside the doctor, their shoes squeaking on the polished floors, their clipped voices rattling off instructions. A monitor beeped steadily, though each sound felt more fragile than the last, a reminder of how thin the thread of life had become. Elena's eyes fluttered open briefly. She clutched at the doctor's wrist with surprising strength, her voice hoarse yet filled with determination. "Please, save my baby. Even if I—" Her words trailed off, swallowed by a spasm of pain that bent her body into a bow. The doctor leaned close, his voice calm but urgent. "We'll do everything, I promise. But you must stay strong, for the child." She nodded faintly, her lips trembling, then closed her eyes again as another contraction ripped through her. Adrian followed, his face pale under the harsh hospital lights. Gone was the groom, draped in arrogance and vanity. In his place stood a man stumbling in silence, his hands trembling as he tried to light a cigarette and failed. He wasn't thinking of Elena's pain, not truly. His mind raced with the image of the guests' shocked faces, the whispers that would follow him forever. His empire was built on reputation, and now it teetered because his wife had dared to collapse in his moment of glory. Selina arrived moments later, her gown dragging across the sterile floor, her beauty suddenly misplaced in this world of rushing nurses and urgent commands. She refused to step into the operating corridor, standing instead with arms crossed, her face twisted with rage and humiliation. "She's doing this to destroy us," she muttered to anyone who would listen, but no one answered her. Even those who might have sided with her at the ballroom now recoiled from her venom. Inside the operating room, the doctor's voice was steady as he directed his team. "Prepare for an emergency delivery. We're losing time." The baby's heartbeat flickered faintly on the monitor, each drop tightening the knot of dread in the room. Elena, drenched in sweat, whispered through her tears, "Save my child. Let her live even if I don't." The doctor glanced at her with a mix of pity and determination, then nodded once, resolute. The night had transformed from a celebration into a battle, and in this sterile white room, the fight was no longer about pride or wealth, it was about survival. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity as the guests who had followed to the hospital waited in anxious silence. The once proud crowd, dressed in glittering gowns and tailored suits, now sat stiff in uncomfortable chairs, their jewels dulled under the sterile fluorescent lights. Adrian paced the hallway, his hand tugging at his collar, his face taut with worry and rage. Selina sat apart from him, her veil discarded, her lips pursed tightly as she whispered complaints to anyone within earshot, though fewer and fewer dared to meet her eye. Every tick of the clock felt like a hammer against their nerves. At last, the operating room door creaked open. The young doctor stepped out, his face weary but resolute. All eyes snapped to him, the silence so heavy that even the hum of the overhead lights seemed deafening. He paused for a moment, adjusting his spectacles, then spoke with the gravity of one who knew his words would change lives. "The mother is alive," he said first, his voice steady, "and so is the child." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the crowd, though Adrian's shoulders remained rigid, as though bracing for another blow. Then the doctor's tone shifted, sharper now, cutting through the fragile air like a blade. "But there is something you all need to know. The child." He glanced briefly at Adrian before continuing. "The child is not his." The words dropped into the hallway like thunder. Gasps erupted, hands flew to mouths, and eyes turned in unison toward Adrian, who staggered back as though struck. His lips parted, his breath catching in his throat, his entire body trembling under the weight of humiliation. The mighty Adrian Blackwood, undone not by scandal alone, but by truth, raw, undeniable truth. Selina's eyes lit up, a flicker of triumph dancing there. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with venom. So she betrayed him, finally exposed for what she really is. But before she could savor her moment, the doctor raised a hand, his gaze stern. No. She did not betray him. She found comfort in someone who truly cared for her when she was abandoned. This child belongs to a man who loves her. His voice softened for the first time, carrying both truth and compassion. Daniel Blackwood, Adrian's cousin. The hall erupted once more, but this time the whispers were not just scandal, they were condemnation. Adrian's empire, his pride, his carefully constructed mask of power cracked open before them all. Selina's smirk faltered as the weight of the truth settled, for this revelation did not crown her the victor, it left her standing beside a broken man, in the ashes of his disgrace. The whispers in the hospital corridor grew louder, swelling like a tide impossible to hold back. Adrian's face burned under the weight of every gaze, his jaw clenched so tightly that a vein pulsed at his temple. But while he seethed in humiliation, the doctor's words lingered in the minds of the guests, unlocking pieces of truth they had overlooked for too long. Slowly, the story of Elena and Daniel began to unfold. Daniel Blackwood had always been the quiet shadow to Adrian's thunder. Where Adrian flaunted wealth and power, Daniel lived simply, preferring sincerity over spectacle. Guests remembered seeing him once or twice near Elena at family gatherings, his posture protective, his gaze gentle. At the time, it had seemed unremarkable, just a cousin offering kindness. But now, in the harsh glow of revelation, those moments shimmered with meaning. Elena had been starved of compassion in a loveless marriage, and Daniel had been the only one to see her pain. The truth began to piece itself together in hushed recollections. People remembered how Adrian had flaunted Selina openly, parading her through society as though his wife didn't exist. Elena had stood silently at his side in those days, her eyes distant, her dignity unbroken even as gossips circled like vultures. It was during that exile of the heart, when Adrian had abandoned her for another woman, that Daniel had become her anchor. He had visited quietly, bringing her food, checking on her health, speaking to her with the gentleness she had not known in years. Somewhere in those stolen moments of kindness, love had bloomed, not scandalous, but inevitable. Now, as the doctor's revelation sank deeper, the crowd realized the hypocrisy laid bare before them. Adrian, who had paraded his mistress in front of everyone, was the one who had betrayed vows first. Elena, who had been silent and steadfast, had found in Daniel not betrayal but salvation. The child she carried was not a symbol of deceit, it was proof that she had not been completely destroyed by Adrian's cruelty. Selina's fury twisted into unease as the tide of judgment shifted. The whispers turned against Adrian and her, condemning their arrogance, mocking the empire that had crumbled in one night. And though Elena still lay weak behind the hospital doors, her quiet strength echoed louder than anything either of them had ever displayed. For the first time, the mighty Adrian Blackwood was seen not as a man to be admired, but as a fool, outshone by the very cousin he had long dismissed, undone by the very wife he had tried to erase. Adrian's hands shook as he tried to steady himself against the cold white wall of the hospital corridor. The humiliation clung to him like a second skin, impossible to peel away. Everywhere he turned, eyes pierced him, some filled with pity, most with disdain. The whispers had grown bold now, no longer hushed but sharp, slicing into him with every cruel syllable. He flaunted his mistress and was betrayed by his own wife. The great Adrian Blackwood, brought down in a single night. His ears rang with their judgment, and his chest tightened with a rage he could not contain. He lurched forward, pointing a trembling finger at the doctor. "You lie." His voice cracked, desperate, yet hollow. "You don't know what you're saying, this is a trick." But even as the words left his mouth, he could feel the weakness in them. The doctor stood firm, his gaze unflinching. "The test results are undeniable. This is not about pride or shame, it is truth. Accept it or not, it doesn't change the reality." Selina stepped forward then, her voice rising, harsh and shrill. "You see. She deceived you. She's been plotting this all along, to humiliate us both." Her words reached the crowd, but instead of swaying them, they soured the air. People turned their heads, their expressions sharp with judgment. One man spat quietly, "Deceived? He paraded you around while his wife carried his name. And now you dare to play the victim." Selina faltered, her painted lips trembling as she realized the tide had fully turned against her. Business associates, men who had once toasted Adrian's victories, began to step back, exchanging looks that spoke of deals reconsidered, investments withdrawn. Reputation was the currency Adrian had hoarded all his life, and now it was worth nothing. His empire, so carefully crafted, trembled on the brink of collapse with every murmured vow to sever ties. Selina's hand slipped from his arm. She looked at him with contempt, her fury no longer masked. "I won't be chained to a ruined man," she spat, the final fracture in their alliance. She turned on her heel and left, her gown trailing behind her like smoke from a fire burned out too soon. Adrian remained where he was, his body sagging against the wall, his eyes hollow. He had fought so hard to climb higher than everyone else, only to fall harder than anyone could have imagined. Stripped of power, abandoned by the woman he chose over his wife, mocked by the society he once ruled, Adrian Blackwood was no longer feared, no longer admired. He was nothing but a man broken by his own pride. Elena awoke in the soft glow of the recovery room, her body weak but alive. The sterile beeping of machines surrounded her, yet it was the faint, fragile cry that pierced the air which pulled tears to her eyes. Turning her head, she saw a nurse gently placing a bundled newborn into her arms. The baby's tiny fingers curled instinctively around her own, and in that instant, all the pain, humiliation, and fear melted away. She cradled the child against her chest, her tears falling not from sorrow but from relief. Against every odd, she had survived, and so had her child. The doctor entered quietly, his expression softened now. "Both of you will recover," he said gently. "You're stronger than anyone thought." Elena nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's all that matters now." Her gaze lingered on the child with a love so fierce it filled the sterile room with warmth. Moments later, the door creaked open again, and Daniel stepped inside. His eyes brimmed with emotion, his usually steady composure breaking as he saw Elena alive, holding the child who bore his blood. He moved closer, almost hesitant, as though afraid the sight might dissolve like a dream. Elena looked up at him, her lips trembling into a smile. "She's yours," she whispered. Daniel's breath caught, and his knees weakened as he knelt beside her bed, gently brushing his hand over the baby's head. "Ours," he corrected softly, his voice thick with devotion. Outside the room, whispers still lingered in the corridors, about scandal, about disgrace. But here, none of that mattered. For the first time in years, Elena felt the heavy chains of humiliation slip away. She was no longer the discarded wife standing in her husband's shadow. She was a mother, a woman who had endured and emerged stronger, and now she was loved. Not for her status, not for her silence, but for her heart. Through the glass window, Adrian watched, his face hollow. The life he had tossed aside now glowed brighter than anything he had ever held. The respect he had once demanded now belonged to Elena, whose quiet dignity had outshone his arrogance. She held in her arms not just a child but a new beginning, one Adrian could never be part of. And as Daniel pressed a kiss to her forehead, promising with his eyes what words could not, Adrian understood the bitter truth. He had lost everything, while Elena, once broken, now held everything that truly mattered. Weeks passed, and the scandal that had once gripped the city slowly faded into background whispers, though the sting of it never left Adrian. Stripped of influence, abandoned by investors, and deserted by Selina, he wandered through the ruins of his own pride, a man haunted by what he had lost. His mansion, once alive with glittering parties and hollow laughter, stood quiet and empty, echoing with silence. He had gambled his life on vanity, and now he lived in its shadow, forgotten. Elena, meanwhile, found peace in simplicity. She left behind the marble halls and chandeliers that had once felt like cages, choosing instead a quiet home surrounded by gardens and sunlight. There, she and Daniel raised their daughter with love rather than wealth, filling their days with laughter, stories, and gentle promises. Neighbors admired her resilience, speaking not of scandal but of strength, the woman who had endured humiliation only to rise brighter than before. On quiet evenings, Elena would sit by the window, rocking her child gently, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and determination. She no longer carried the weight of being Adrian Blackwood's wife. She was her own, defined not by betrayal but by survival and love. Daniel's hand often rested on her shoulder, grounding her, a silent vow that she would never face the world alone again. The memory of the night she collapsed at the wedding lingered still, but no longer as a wound. It was a turning point, a moment where lies shattered, masks fell, and truth emerged stronger than gold. Adrian's arrogance had crumbled under its own weight, but Elena's quiet courage had carried her through. In the end, love had triumphed, not in the ballroom, but in the quiet embrace of a family built on sincerity.